She found him near death, a secret that could ignite the desert. Isolated and haunted by the past, she risked everything for an unknown boy. But when the truth came to light, a terrible choice had to be made, changing their destinies forever. A story of courage, sacrifice, and an unlikely love. Get ready because this journey will keep you hooked from start to finish. Subscribe to the channel, leave your like, and comment where you're watching from. At the break of dawn, when the wind still hesitated to scatter the day's sands, the reddish dust was already announcing itself. It arrived like a ghost on the horizon, a promise of dryness and isolation that thickened with each passing moment. Fine as talc, it carried the bitter taste of hopelessness, a flavor Mary knew intimately, like the tang of a wild fruit that never ripens. The palpable red haze infiltrated every crack of the solitary cabin, a constant testament to the fragility of life in that wilderness. It settled on Mary's few belongings, on the rustic wood of the table, on the worn blanket on her makeshift bed, and, more deeply, on her heart. Her face, more lined by trials than by the years she actually counted, was a map of harsh weather, where each line told a story of loss or a small victory against desolation. She oscillated, like the landscape itself, between the resilience of a prickly cactus, capable of blooming in the most absolute adversity, and the ethereal fragility of a desert flower, which blossoms for an instant before being consumed by the sun. Mary's gaze, often lost in the ochre vastness that stretched as far as the eye could no longer reach, carried the persistent shadow of an old loss, an echo of helplessness that was both her curse and her drive. It pushed her to mend what she could, a piece of dried leather for her moccasins, the fragile fence of branches that protected her small herb garden, or, if possible, a wounded soul that crossed her path. The internal conflict that gnawed at her day and night was the paralyzing fear of failing again, of witnessing once more a life slipping through her fingers like fine sand. This guilt, the constant wind seemed to whisper in her ears, an endless lament that accompanied the howl of the cold nights. Solitude, in that vastness, was a shadow that lengthened with the setting sun, a faithful companion of her arid days, an almost physical presence that sat with her at the meager meal. The sun, an incandescent hammer in the sky of an unforgiving blue, punished the plains relentlessly, transforming the air into a furnace. It was under this brutal light, which blinded and revealed with equal cruelty, that she found him. Almost merged with the dry, cracked earth, a small dark spot against the reddish clay, was a body, a boy. His dark skin, characteristic of the plains people, was feverish to the touch, marked by strange pustules and a deadly pallor beneath the natural tone. Dying, his eyes, half open, focused on nothing, lost in a feverish delirium. Instinct, that primordial force that life on the edge had taught her to respect more than any cautious advice, spoke louder than fear, louder than prudence. Caution was a lesson learned the hard way, but compassion, or perhaps the memory of her own pain, was a stronger current. She lifted him from the ground with a delicacy that contrasted with the roughness of her calloused hands. His breathing was a faint puff, almost imperceptible against her neck, a small bellows of life that threatened to stop at any moment. She carried him to the precarious shelter of her dwelling, a refuge of mud and wood that was more a den than a house. Inside, the air was less hostile, although it still carried the smell of the omnipresent dust. The crackle of dry wood in the makeshift fireplace, which she quickly lit, and the earthy aroma of the herbs she began to boil in a small iron pot, were the only sounds that broke the heavy silence, besides the child's low, intermittent moan. The rules of that world were brutal and clear. Every man for himself, and suspicion was the current coin, more valuable than any gold. The few settlers at the outpost, a day's exhausting ride towards the setting sun, viewed her with an uncomfortable mix of fear and disdain. The isolated woman, the hermit who, according to rumors, conversed with the spirits of the earth and knew secrets best left undisturbed. She knew, with the certainty of someone walking on a minefield, that sheltering that boy was an immense risk. A spark that could ignite the already tense prairie of relations between the newcomers and the native peoples, whose lands were increasingly invaded. But looking at the small face contorted by pain, the memory of another fever, of another small body she couldn't save, tightened her chest. This time she would try, with all her strength. Mary dedicated herself to the boy, whom in her thoughts she began to call John, a name that sounded strong and resilient like the desert stones. The first days were a constant battle against death. The fever came and went like a treacherous tide, leaving the small body exhausted and trembling. She applied cold compresses soaked in teas of rare herbs, whose secrets she had learned from an old healer of her own people. Long before she isolated herself, she forced thin broths and fresh water between the boy's parched lips, whispering words of comfort in a language he probably didn't understand, but whose tone conveyed a gentle urgency. The cabin became an improvised infirmary, permeated by the acrid smell of infusions and the tense silence of waiting. It was on a particularly hot afternoon, when the sun seemed determined to cook the very earth, that William appeared. He was different from the other settlers at the outpost. A tall man with broad shoulders, with eyes the color of the sky before a storm, generally silent and observant. A skilled hunter who spent long periods alone in the vastness, and perhaps for that reason understood a little of Mary's solitude, although they had never exchanged more than formal and distant greetings on the rare occasions she went to the outpost for essential supplies. He approached the cabin without fanfare, following the almost imperceptible trail of smoke coming from the crude chimney. Mary saw him through the crack in the door, and her heart turned to ice. Her first instinct was to hide John, but it was too late. William stopped a few steps away, his gaze sweeping the scene with calm intensity. He saw the concern on Mary's face, the small figure under the blankets. For an instant, she expected the accusation, the threat, but he merely nodded, an indecipherable expression on his face. Then, without a word, he untied a water skin from his saddle and extended it to her. Fresh water, taken from a spring that only the most experienced knew. A simple gesture, but one that, in that place and at that moment, was worth more than gold. Mary accepted, a murmur of gratitude escaping her lips. He asked no questions, offered no unsolicited advice. He just stood there for a moment, his eyes meeting hers. And in them she saw not condemnation, but a kind of reluctant respect, perhaps even contained compassion. It was the first thread of an invisible web that was beginning to form between them. However, John's presence could not remain a secret for long. The more constant smoke from Mary's chimney, her longer absences collecting herbs, everything was noticed in that environment where any alteration in routine generated suspicion. The news that the isolated woman was harboring a native child, and a sick one at that, spread through the outpost like wildfire. Fear, fueled by ignorance and old hostilities, grew among the settlers. Their suspicion was a barbed wire fence, invisible but painfully real, surrounding her cabin and tightening the noose around her fragile peace. One morning, the sound of approaching horses made Mary drop the bowl of porridge she was preparing for John, who was already showing faint signs of improvement. It was 3 men from the outpost, led by Mark Smith, a settler with a hard face and cold eyes, known for his declared aversion to the native peoples and his sharp tongue. They stopped in front of the cabin, their postures aggressive. Smith dismounted, his gun belt rattling. "We heard you're hiding a savage here, woman," he said, his voice raspy as gravel. "A sick one, bringing plague near us." Mary stood in the doorway, blocking the passage with her body. She felt her legs trembling, but her voice came out firm. "He's just a child, and he's not bringing any plague. He's recovering." "We want to see him," Smith insisted, stepping forward. "To make sure he's not a threat." One of the other men, younger and nervous, mumbled something about their children being at risk. The fear was palpable, almost as dense as the dust. Mary didn't yield. "He's no threat to anyone. He's under my care. Go away." The standoff lasted for minutes that felt like hours. The morning sun beat down hard, highlighting the hostile glint in Smith's eyes. He growled a veiled threat about returning with more men if she didn't cooperate. Finally, reluctantly, they backed away, leaving behind a trail of dust and an even greater tension in the air. Mary leaned against the door, her heart pounding erratically. She knew that was just the beginning. John, sensing the commotion, looked at her with his large dark eyes, now more alert. She forced a smile and went back inside, determination solidifying in her chest. She would protect him. In the following weeks, John recovered slowly. He began to babble a few words in Mary's language, and she patiently tried to learn something of his language through gestures and sounds. A silent and deep bond formed between the woman marked by loss and the boy torn from his people. One of those afternoons, while mending an old leather pouch sitting outside the cabin, enjoying the softer light of late day, William passed by again. He was coming from the direction of the river, carrying some hides. He stopped at a respectful distance. John, who was sitting near Mary, watched the newcomer with cautious curiosity. William did not address the boy directly, but his eyes rested for an instant on the small wooden amulet John was holding, a crudely carved bird. He then took a small object from his pouch and offered it to Mary. It was a bone awl, thin and sharp, perfect for working leather. "I saw yours was broken," he said simply. Mary was surprised. It was a valuable tool. She in turn remembered a small cut she had seen on his hand days before, when he had given her water. She went inside the cabin and returned with a small pot of salve made from animal fat and healing herbs. "For your hand," she said, extending it. Their fingers brushed briefly as he took the pot. An unexpected warmth ran through her arm. He thanked her with a nod, and a near smile softened his rough features. The exchange was brief, functional, but loaded with unspoken meaning. It was a mutual recognition, a small bridge built over the chasm of distrust that separated their worlds. The hostility of the settlers, however, did not diminish. Mark Smith continued to incite fear, painting Mary as a traitor and John as an imminent danger. Her trips to the outpost became impossible. Now she depended on her own hunting and gathering skills, and on the rare and discreet help from William, who sometimes left a piece of game meat or a bag of grains near her cabin, without ever being seen in the act of delivery. The tension grew like a storm forming on the horizon, dark and threatening. John's fragile improvement suffered a terrible setback. The fever returned with fury higher than before, and new eruptions, dark and inflamed, covered his skin. He moaned incessantly, his small body shaken by violent tremors. Mary felt icy panic grip her heart. All the herbs she knew seemed useless against this new onslaught of the disease. The fear of failing, that old ghost, returned with full force, whispering words of despair in her mind. She then remembered a story told by the old healer about a rare root called moon's tear, which grew only in high and dangerous places, in the crevices of rocks on distant mesas, and was said to be a powerful remedy for incurable fevers and skin ailments. It was a remote hope, almost a legend, but it was the only one she had left. At the same time, news arrived, brought by a somber and concerned William, that Mark Smith was gathering a group of men. The pretext was a patrol against alleged native attacks, but William suspected the real objective was Mary's cabin and the boy. Time was running out. Mary made her decision. She would go after the moon's tear. William, upon hearing her plan, frowned. The indicated mesa was known for its treacherous trails, steep cliffs, and the presence of pumas. "It's too dangerous to go alone," he said, his voice deep. "I'll go with you." Mary hesitated. Accepting his help meant involving him even further in her problem, putting him in direct risk with the other settlers. But his firm gaze left no room for refusal, and the urgency of John's situation outweighed any pride or fear. They left at dusk, leaving John under the effect of a natural sedative Mary had prepared, hoping sleep would protect him from the worst phase of the fever. The journey under the pale moon was tense. Every shadow seemed to hide a threat. Every sound of the night was an alert. As they climbed the steep and slippery trail leading to the top of the mesa, a sudden and violent dust storm hit them. The wind howled like a hungry spirit, whipping their faces with sand and pebbles. They were forced to seek shelter in a small rocky alcove, a dark and cramped recess on the side of the cliff. Sheltered from the wind's fury, the silence between them was filled only by the roar of the storm outside and the sound of their breathing. The forced proximity, the darkness, and the shared danger created an unexpected intimacy. It was William who broke the silence. "I came to the west seeking to forget," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. A war, a loss. I thought the vastness would give me peace, but it only echoes the emptiness. Mary understood. She too carried her own emptiness. I lost my daughter, she confessed, the words coming out with difficulty as if torn from an old wound. A fever, like John's. I couldn't save her. Since then, this place has been my exile and my penance. William said nothing for a long moment, just looked at her in the gloom. And in his eyes she saw a deep understanding, an empathy that transcended words. The storm outside seemed to mirror the tempest in their hearts, but there, in that small cave, they found a brief moment of calm and connection. When the storm subsided, they continued the climb. They found the moon's tear in a narrow, almost inaccessible crevice, its small white flowers glowing fantastically under the moonlight. William, more agile and strong, risked himself to collect the roots. On the way back, urgency propelled them. As they approached the cabin, they saw the glow of torches. Mary's heart sank. Mark Smith and his men were there. Fear, like a cornered beast, snarled in Mary's chest, sharp claws digging into her courage, but the sight of John, defenseless, propelled her forward. William held her arm. Wait, let's think. But there was no time to think. Smith had already seen them. Look at that, the mountain witch and her accomplice, he shouted, his voice heavy with hate. We knew you'd come back. A chaotic confrontation ensued. Smith and his men, about 5 in all, advanced. William pushed Mary back, placing himself between her and the attackers, his hunting knife glinting in the torchlight. Leave us alone, Smith. The boy is sick, he's not a threat. But Smith didn't want to listen. He wanted a scapegoat. He wanted to assert his power. One of the men tried to grab Mary, who defended herself with the small knife she always carried, desperation giving her surprising strength. William fought with 2 at once, his movements quick and precise. But the numerical disadvantage was clear. During the struggle, Smith managed to approach the cabin, kicking the door. Mary screamed, fearing for John. Distracted, one of the men hit her arm with the butt of a pistol, making her stumble. William, seeing her in danger, spun and knocked down the attacker, but this left him vulnerable. Smith seized the opportunity and advanced on him with a club. Mary, recovering quickly, threw herself in front of William, taking part of the blow's impact on her shoulder. The pain blinded her for an instant, but she remained standing, protecting William, who recomposed himself and disarmed Smith with a quick strike. The other men, seeing their leader subdued and the unexpected ferocity of the pair, hesitated. The fight ceased, leaving a trail of gasping breaths, the smell of sweat and fear in the air. Mary and William stood side by side, bruised but firm, protecting the entrance of the cabin where John rested, oblivious to the danger he had just faced. The vulnerability they both showed, the willingness to protect each other, forged a bond stronger than steel between them. Smith, fallen on the ground, looked at them with impotent hatred. The dawn was beginning to tint the sky gray and pink, announcing the end of a terrible night and the beginning of an uncertain day. Before the dust of the confrontation completely settled, a new sound cut through the tense morning air, the rhythmic gallop of many horses. Imposing figures adorned with feathers and war paint emerged on the horizon, riding in tight formation towards the cabin. It was John's people. Mary's heart, which had barely had time to calm down, began to race again. Would they be hostile? Would they blame her for the boy's disappearance and illness? Or would they see what she had tried to do? Mark Smith, still on the ground, sketched a cruel smile, perhaps hoping the newcomers would finish the job he had started. William stood protectively beside Mary, his hand instinctively seeking hers. The warriors stopped at a respectful distance, their faces stoic and unreadable. There were many, perhaps 20 or 30, and their presence was overwhelming. One of them, clearly the leader, an older man with a face marked by scars and wisdom, dismounted and walked slowly towards them. The silence was heavy, charged with an almost unbearable expectation. It was then that the small figure of John appeared in the doorway of the cabin, still weak, leaning on the frame, but with bright, alert eyes. Seeing the warriors of his people, a mixture of joy and surprise lit up his face. He said something in his language, his voice still fragile but clear. He pointed to Mary, then to himself and began to speak, gesturing, telling his story the way he could. The leader listened attentively, his gaze fixed now on John, now on Mary and William. The minutes dragged on. Mary felt cold sweat on her back, the weight of impending judgment. Finally, John finished speaking and looked at the leader expectantly. The man approached Mary. His eyes, dark and penetrating, examined her from head to toe. Then, to everyone's surprise, he inclined his head slightly in a gesture of respect. He spoke in his language, and John, with difficulty, translated some words for Mary. He says, "Thank you for saving my life." An immense relief swept over Mary, so strong that her legs weakened. William discreetly supported her. The leader then turned to Smith and his remaining men, who watched the scene with a mixture of fear and confusion. With a brief command, some warriors surrounded them, disarming them. There was no violence, just a cold and determined efficiency. Smith protested, but a look from the leader silenced him. Justice here would be the justice of the Plains people. John went to meet his people, embraced with emotion. But before going, he ran back to Mary and hugged her tightly, a gesture of pure childlike gratitude that untied the last knots of anguish in her heart. She hugged him back, feeling the tears finally stream down her face. The fear of failing, which had haunted her for so long, began to dissipate. She had not failed John. That echo of helplessness that pursued her began to lose its strength. The warriors remained for some time, ensuring that Smith's threat was contained and establishing initial communication with Mary, through John and through gestures. They offered gifts, fine hides, jerky, medicinal herbs Mary didn't know. It was a recognition, an acceptance. Before leaving with John, who promised to return to visit her, the leader approached William. They exchanged few words, but there seemed to be an understanding. When the Plains people finally left, taking Smith's men with them to be judged according to their laws, a different silence settled over the cabin. It was not the silence of solitude, but that of exhaustion and an incipient peace. William helped Mary clean the traces of the fight and tend to her injuries. As she cleaned the cut on her shoulder, he held her hand for a moment. "You were brave," he said, his voice hoarse. "We were," she corrected, looking into his eyes. In the days that followed, the news of what had happened spread through the outpost. Some settlers, the most extreme, saw William as a traitor. Others, however, began to question Smith's leadership and the blind hostility towards the native peoples. William made his decision. He would not return to the outpost in the same way. His loyalty was now here, with Mary, with the promise of a different future. He began to help Mary reinforce the cabin, build a more solid fence for her garden. They worked together in comfortable synchrony, their conversations filling the silence that had once been hers alone. One afternoon, while repairing the damaged roof, he stopped and looked at her. "I could stay around," he said almost shyly. "If you want." Mary smiled, a genuine smile that lit up her tired face. "I would like that." His sacrifice, the choice to stay by her and John's side, risking his own safety and position among the settlers, was the final seal on their bond. It was not a fairy tale romance, but something forged in the fire of adversity, built on mutual respect, shared courage, and a silent understanding of each other's wounds. The reddish dust continued to arrive with the wind, but now for Mary, it no longer brought only the bitter taste of hopelessness. It also brought the memory of resilience, connection, and the possibility of healing. The newfound peace was a tender sprout, striving to break through the hardened crust of that land and the hearts that inhabited it. The sun was still unforgiving, but under its light, Mary no longer felt so alone. She had found not only the redemption of her past, but a companion to face the coming days. And hope, once a distant mirage, now seemed like a hidden spring, ready to be discovered. Life in the desert would continue to be hard, full of challenges, but she was no longer just mending pieces. She was building something new, something strong, something that perhaps could flourish.